Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on behalf of American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage, APPIH. It's our great honor to start a panel discussion in future of oil industry. Before starting, just two short announcements. First, during and after discussion, you can write your question in the chat box, plus the name and the panelist name that you would like to answer to your question. And please, during the discussion and Q&A, switch off your camera and microphone. And the second recorded version of this panel discussion shortly after finishing will be available at APPIH social networks. Okay, let's introduce today's moderator. It's our great honor that today we have Mr. Fred Araste from the Valco Energy Company as a moderator. He has significant experience in evaluating petroleum resources and optimizing oil and gas asset production domestically and internationally. I would like to thank Mr. Araste for accepting our invitation, and without further delay, I'm transferring mic to him for starting the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this honor to moderate this very distinguished panel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the APPIH panel discussion. This is about the current and future oil industry. We try to address main concerns that our audience may have, and going through the questions one by one. I'm going to be asking basically going maybe over with as an alphabetic kind of system of our panelists. But before that, let me introduce this very distinguished panel. I start on, as I said, on an alphabetic order. Dr. Ghasem Bayat, we're honored to have him on this panel. He's the CEO of New Dawn Energy. He has a vast experience in domestic, international oil and gas industry. He has been with majors, and he has recently focused in acquiring and developing oil and gas assets in major US basins. Welcome to our round, Dr. Bayat. Next is Dr. Ali Daneshy. He is the CEO of Daneshy Consultants International and adjunct faculty member of petroleum engineering at the University of Houston. Dr. Daneshy is a founding member and a past president of the American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage. He held senior positions at Halliburton, and his expertise is in well completion and stimulation. Welcome on board, Dr. Daneshy. Next is Dr. Hamid Ghoddusi. He is an assistant professor in the Stevens Institute of Technology at the School of Business. His interests are in energy and commodity finance, investment under uncertainty, and risk management. Welcome aboard.
Exactly.
Next is Mr. Farrokh Pebdani. He's an international consultant. He has vast experience in petroleum research and development and domestic and international assets. Welcome aboard, Mr. Pebdani. Next is Mr. Vahid Serajian. He is the CEO and founder of APPIH Geoscience. He's currently working with the US government in evaluating and forecasting major helium accumulations in the US. His interests include alternative energy sources. And last but not least, Dr. Manochehr Takin is an international oil and energy consultant. He has hands-on experience with international operators, as well as working directly for OPEC's organization in Vienna, Austria. Dr. Takin appears regularly as a recognized expert in world media. Welcome aboard all our panelists. I'm amazed to be moderating this very interesting discussion. And honored to do that. So I start with our first question, and the way I'm gonna go through these questions is I'm going to ask first a general question, and then alphabetically I will ask our panelists to comment if they like to. Or maybe later on I ask specific panelists because of his background and experience, and I will open it up afterwards to other panelists to comment. The first question, and it has a general nature, is what we have experienced just in the last few days and weeks. An amazing roller coaster of oil price. The West Texas Intermediate collapsed to negative values. The question is that in all of our minds has been, how did this happen? Was it all due to the COVID-19? And has such a thing happened any time in the past? Do you think there is a quick recovery to it? So with this, I'd like to open up the panel and ask Dr. Bayat to make his comments on this, if he likes.
Thank you very much. Years ago in BP, all the managers, few of us, some dozen or so, got together to work out what could happen to sink BP, basically bankrupt the company. And we all came up with various strategies, various possibilities, such as explosion of LNG tanker in the port of Japan, for example. And on that very same day, we suddenly had the Exxon Valdez happening. And within 5 or 6 hours, we thought BP is going to sink, but Exxon accepted the responsibility and nothing really happened to BP. But none of us imagined a virus that we can't even see with a standard microscope could suddenly create such a chaos in the world. We have had all kinds of theories about the supply, the demand side, but we never thought that the demand could disappear so incredibly universally. Out of probably 95 million barrels a day of production in the world, we may have something in the order of 30 million or so at the moment in the form of demand. So we have a surplus of 60+ million barrels a day or so. That being the case, I don't believe the unwise action of Russia and Saudi Arabia, although it was a terrible thing what they did, but had really any impact. It just focused the attention on the supply side. But as I said, the problem is demand. With regards to whether we're going to recover and how long it takes, it will take as long as it takes for the industrial scale activities to return back to normal. China getting back to production, in Southeast Asia, countries such as South Korea getting back to operation, Vietnam starting, Japan, Europe, as well as America and Canada. Until such time, there will not be a recovery, because even if OPEC goes and cuts back its 40 or so million barrels a day of production, we still have a surplus. Therefore, the solution will come only after we find a vaccine for this, or somehow, which I don't believe is going to happen, mankind accepts a very high mortality rate of opening up the businesses regardless of the human cost, which I don't think this is going to happen. So at least for the next 6 months to a year until vaccine appears, as well as solutions to the current large number of people who have been infected by this virus, we are going to live in this very unfortunate situation. It's just simply a case of demand being so low at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bayat, for a nice introduction. Dr. Daneshy, I know you have a lot of focus internationally and domestically, especially working with the domestic operators. What are your thoughts in that direction?
Well, I generally concur with what Dr. Bayat said. The only thing I would add is that I think the U.S. energy market will recover faster than the international market. U.S. industry is better poised to restart, and because of the separation between us and Middle East and Europe, I think we will see a gradual resurrection of the oil and gas industry, maybe around the third or fourth quarter of this year. So our situation is a little bit better than what we expect to see internationally.
Thank you, Dr. Daneshy. Dr. Ghoddusi, you have studied markets in the past. Have you seen this before? Do you think it happened before?
Right. Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. Of course, there's a similar market to the oil market, which is the electricity market. There we constantly see negative prices. And that happens when the supply side has constraints to cut the production and the demand is so low, so you have to actually pay money to your customers to take the load off from your generators, basically. So whenever we teach modeling energy prices, we used to say, okay, for electricity prices, we can take this assumption that the price can become negative. However, for the history of oil market, I believe we had not seen it before until last month. So this week was not actually the first time. Last month, we had a brief episode of a few landlocked US producers who also went negative. And people were asking me, how come the price becomes negative? So that was my steps of explaining that as a supplier, if you do not have enough flexibility to cut your production, and I think I'm not qualified to comment on that, but from what I learned from engineers is that you cannot just shut down the production of a field or a wall. It's costly. So you may contemplate that you may continue rather than incurring the cost of shutting down and then bring it back. So that's the first thing, that your supply is sluggish. The second condition you need is that you do not have a space to store. If you have space to store, you can do what we call the intertemporal transfer of production. You produce today, but you not put it in the market. So second condition you need is that you do not have a place to store. And the third one is that the demand is so weak that even if you give a low price, demand is not going to respond to that. So what we saw in the futures contracts of WTI, I think it's important to look at the anatomy of the negative futures price, because we saw it for WTI, but we did not see a parallel episode for Brent. And that goes back to the difference of where is their pricing hub located, basically. We all know WTI is priced in Cushing. I was in Cushing a few months ago, and I could never imagine that this tiny town in Oklahoma is going to be in the headlines of news. So what happened there was that Cushing has approximately 75 million barrels of effective storage capacity. And the numbers that I checked yesterday is telling us that we are almost there. We are not exactly there, but we are almost there, and the capacity is already booked. So it means that if you had a delivery of WTI and you had the settlement location for Cushing and you didn't have anybody to buy it from you, you had to get rid of it at any cost because you have no place to put it. It didn't happen for Brent because Brent is traded in the international market overseas. You have tankers, so you still have more globally distributed capacity to store, so still they could survive. But my conclusion from us that, okay, this was one episode. It only happened for one day for futures contracts settling for May. But to me, it was the peak of the iceberg. Basically, it's telling us that reflects the general disequilibrium between supply, demand, and storage capacity in the market. And I think everybody is eagerly looking at next month to see whether the same is going to happen, or if the market is going to be more conscious, take into account the storage capacity limitations in advance, and rather than having a very sharp price decline, maybe we smoothly go to a lower price. These are the things that we are carefully watching. But my only point was that this was an episode very much depending on Cushing's capacity being full. And then we can start from there, and then a question how much we can extend the same phenomenon to the global market. Thank you.
It sounds like a perfect storm. Perfect storm happened. Everything basically come together.
Yeah, came together, yes.
For that crash, right? I'd like to ask Mr. Pebdani about his thoughts in the same direction, how the operating companies do you think are going to handle this?
Let me add a few more things. There was a report today that Bloomberg is saying that there was market manipulation, what happened on Tuesday. So no doubt the negative price may happen again, or it may not happen again in the future or next month's contract expiring. So that's one thing to keep in mind. When it comes to future pricing for next month, the operators, physically, it's impossible to load up the facilities anymore. Even the strategic petroleum reserves are capable of getting 20, 50 million barrels tops. And there is no space to store, so they have to shut some of the wells in. And I am sure the oil refiners, they probably benefited from those negative oil prices. They would love to have the big boys, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Valero. They would be happy to get the oil, and if they had the storage, and then later on process it and sell it. But physically for next month, there won't be any storage, and the producers will have to cut. Okay, a lot of people are reluctant to cut shale production because they say the wells may not come back on. But not all of the West Texas Permian oil is shale. All the CO2 floods, they can be easily shut in and brought back on in a very orderly manner later on. And that is a direction. There has to be production cuts because the demand is not coming back.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Serajian, you have been working with the U.S. government. What's your thought? How things can go forward for the short term?
Well, in the short term, I guess the situations are not really good, especially for the domestic U.S. producers, especially from the regulatory standpoint. And in some of the states, I think we have some strict regulations and even penalties for shutting in some of the wells. Even some of the states like North Dakota, they had to change some of the regulations in order to allow shutting in wells, because many of these E&P companies, they have to pay royalties, they have to pay certain taxes for the states. So this have like a chain consequences for the states, for the shareholders, and eventually for the government. So this is not a good thing for the government in the short run. In addition, there's a positive side to this from the government standpoint, and that's the stimulus packages, and the fact that the government is trying to support oil and gas companies, either financially or politically. I know there's been a lot of backstage pressures from the US government into Russia and Saudi Arabia to push them to reduce their production, but I'm not sure at this point how effective that's gonna be. I know, of course, US has a lot of leverages in hand to pressurize these companies, either financially or taking out the support from some of the collaborations that US has with these countries like Saudi Arabia in confronting Iran, for example. But I'm not sure how effective those chips are at this moment, because I have a feeling that countries like Saudi Arabia, at this point, they intentionally put this output like as much as they can, just to influence US production, because in the long term, this will impact their own geopolitical situation. Because if the US is not dependent on Saudi Arabia's oil, then Saudi Arabia will lose its geopolitical importance in the Middle East. You hear a lot from Trump saying that we don't need Saudi Arabian oil or Middle Eastern oil, and we produce whatever oil we need. So this is a danger and an alert for Saudi Arabia in a fact that they want to be more and more dependent. They want the US to be more dependent on them. So just to summarize, I think the pressures that US can put on some of these oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia can be effective. The stimulus packages will be a short-term solution, but in long term, the effects are probably lasting.
Thank you, Mr. Serajian. This is a good lead into Dr. Takin to hear his thoughts on international arena. With how do you see, Dr. Takin, the international situation is going to change with this oil price collapse?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and it's pleasure, good to be with all friends, because we got together, I think, a few years ago, and I had the honor to visit all members of the club, and we met in Houston and others, you know, San Antonio. So it is good to be with you again. It's my pleasure. I think the esteemed colleagues of the panel have already explained and alluded to so many aspects of this. If you don't mind, I will just give a round number of the order of magnitude of the figures first for ourselves to clarify in our mind. So the oil consumption is about 100 million barrels per day in the world today. But this, because of the limitations imposed on societies because of the corona, it has fallen by about 20 million barrels per day, or 30 or 35 million barrels per day. So there is still oil being produced and used, but it is fallen by 25–30%. And it has been a shock. This is one thing to get the numbers right. And another point is that, another point, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Am I connected yet?
Yeah.
Yes.
I am in communication.
Yes, you are.
Okay. And another point, yes, and another point is to give you why this happened. You see, the oil market supply has been gradually slightly more than demand in the last few years. I won't take time to explain why and when, but many of us know it is the success of the colleagues in the United States, the shale oil and so on. And the OPEC as an organization of the consuming countries trying to organize, as an organization of oil exporting countries, trying to get together and defend the price. And so they did it in the previous decades, all of them reducing production, say, by 500,000 barrels per day, 1 million. In 2014, which again, there was excess, and they have been cutting 1 or 2 million. Then they said that they required the other countries, other non-OPEC countries to join, and asked Russia. Russia, unfortunately, didn't agree in 2014. It took 2 years until the non-OPEC group, led by Russia, they came in. So from 2017, it has been a large group of producers, OPEC and non-OPEC, about 30 of them, let's say, who have been reducing their production and defending the price, meeting every 6 months or so, and adjusting their supply in order to get the price, stop it to collapse. And they had a meeting in March in this year, and they had studied the experts from OPEC Secretariat, and of course the oil companies themselves, the countries, and the reduction, they thought it has to be something like 2–3 million at that time. This was in February, the estimate. And the Russians were not ready to agree. They thought it was too much, and they were asking questions. They proposed that maybe we continue as it is and see what is the impact of the corona on the actual consumption, and then have another meeting. Here, there are differences of opinion of how this happened, but apparently Saudi Arabian minister and the Russian minister, they sort of had to stand off against each other, and so they parted company, the group which had been working together for 3 years. And with that, Saudi Arabia announced that there was going to, the kingdom would increase its production, its supply, and give discounts from the beginning of May. And that was a factor on top of everything else to get the price down. So the price coming down was really because there was a collapse in supply, 20, 30 million barrels per day, less oil demanded in the world market, and that OPEC and non-OPEC at that time couldn't agree on how much to cut. And so the situation became worse and worse. And has been this case in the previous major crises, that other than the oil ministers at the end, when it becomes very serious, you have the prime ministers and the presidents and kings get involved, as we had 1986, Vice President George Bush and so on. And in here, then we had the role played by President Trump. And I think overall, the industry is giving credit to President Trump, because although he was very much anti-OPEC and he said, I hate OPEC and so on the previous years, now, the last few weeks, he realized that OPEC is an organization and that they could do something and they have to rely on them. So he encouraged OPEC and had a chat with President Putin at a very high level, with the Saudi Crown Prince and others, and he kept talking to them on the phone until they got together and decided to cut by 10 million barrels per day, which of course they said that this would not be sufficient, and we need the rest of the world to join in, including US, Canada, and others. And then there was a G20 meeting a few days later, the following day, and in that also President Trump made a major role by telephoning President Putin the night before, the same day, and so on. So at the end, we had this agreement that the group, OPEC, non-OPEC, would cut by 10 million barrels per day, hoping the rest would also join in. It, of course, had a positive impact. The prices went up a little bit. But when the market began to think that, okay, how is the US going to help this group? And that is the US going to cut production? Is the president going to tell small producers to reduce production and so on? So it made the price collapse and fall again. And we are in that phase, that this optimism, the market expected that other producers would join in. The US, for example, would buy oil and put it into the strategic reserves of the United States. A little help it would be. But more importantly, thought that, for example, Texas Railroad Commission might try to give quota to producers. And in Canada, Alberta government might do that. And so the supply becoming less. In Brazil joining in, unfortunately, they did not join in. And so the market expectations of getting the price to come back, it didn't happen. And alongside with this physical trading, there is paper trading. Those who bought had sell the futures in the futures market without the intention of actually getting delivery of oil. And this trading goes on from many months before. But at the end, there has to be an end into this paper barrel trading. And that was last Monday or for the Tuesday morning. And those who had been speculating, playing casino, and getting to a wrong position, they were left with this certificate that they had to get the oil. And so they were prepared to give discount and even pay extra for someone to take it off their hand. Now that situation, it could happen again this is for the oil to be delivered in May. It could also happen as to be delivered in June. I think as many colleagues mentioned, that hopefully by then in another month, the industry and the actual players will do something to ameliorate this problem. But the problem is still there. It won't go away. The extra oil coming into the market is still there. The companies, by force, they might be, as I already have, some shale producers have closed down. They are not producing anymore. But it will take time. So in answer, it will take some time before we get the supply-demand coming into more or less a balance.
Takin, thank you so much. And what you're saying makes complete sense. Hopefully the players learned from it and they collaborate in a better manner going forward. Now, the question that stays in the room is, and I'd like to ask you about it, is how do you see the future for OPEC? Are they really any more relevant in managing the market?
Asking me?
Yes, and we have probably
Oh,
2-3 minutes for this. It would be great if you could
Yes.
enlighten
Well,
us.
I think OPEC as an organization will remain. In fact, what I just very quickly try to summarize, it has played a very important role. In fact, the President Trump has thanked OPEC for doing this. It shows, and this is really a philosophical point in the last century up, with the oil industry, that if we leave completely free market supply and demand, there will be fluctuations. In the early days in Pennsylvania and so on, people were drilling, and then the price of oil collapsed, and many people become bankrupt. And then there was a shortage of oil. There was East Texas discovery. Again, the prices collapsed, and so on. Within the early days, within the United States, on a global basis, the same thing has been happening. So, should we leave the oil supply, demand, and to the market? And unfortunately, it will have this fluctuation, which is harmful for both producers and consumers. It is harmful for consumers, although they receive cheap fuel. But as we know, in this case now, the oil industry have cut from their capital expenditure, exploration, production, investment. I think instead of $150 billion, they're now going to spend, I think, $70 billion. They have cut about, let's say, $50, $60 billion less. So if there is less money in drilling and exploration and so on, there will be less new oil coming on stream. So in a few years' time, there will be shortage of supply. So there is this danger, and it is there, which I think is trying to regulate the market in a cooperative way, is what OPEC has been playing a role. The role of OPEC has changed compared with what it was in the early days against the Seven Sisters. But it has been, I think, playing a positive role, that even the free marketers in the US, the government, have accepted it.
Can I add a comment here? I think part of the price war, like consequences of the price war, is due to OPEC's struggle to get its role back. So imagine OPEC is producing about 40% of global oil, but it, on the other hand, has nearly 75% of the proven reserves in the world. So imagine from OPEC's perspective, if you own nearly 75% of the global reserve and just produce 40%, you can produce oil as cheap as possible. But gradually, OPEC is feeling the danger of non-OPEC producers coming into play, and also the renewable sector, which is gradually growing. And this is a direct danger for OPEC. So I see this as an intentional effort by OPEC to try to put a war in a way that a renewable energy sector, which costs higher, the US producers, which have higher production costs, they go bankrupt, or their production goes down, and then the OPEC gets its historical role back. On the other hand, it seems that historically, most of the price regulation or production reduction burden has been on OPEC. Whenever the oil price goes up and down, everybody expects OPEC to just interfere. But they just produce only 40%. So they say, okay, we lower the price, we lower our profit margin, but on the other hand, Russia, China, and the US and Brazil are increasing their production. So this is a direct danger for OPEC. And I think one of the reasons why OPEC is trying to pump as much oil as possible to the market at this condition is just to destroy some of these competitors and kick them out of the market.
May I add some comments here, please?
Sure.
Okay, the relevance of OPEC is, Dr. Takin said, OPEC will remain. But an OPEC where Iran is producing zero, Venezuela is producing zero, and Libya is almost nil, is not really an existing OPEC. It's a gamble by one or two nations. I would put Russia as part of OPEC going forward. You got to remember, this will force the shale producers in West Texas and Bakken to bring their break-even price to less than 20. And they will come back the moment oil hits 20, 25, 30 bucks. The shale guys are not going to go bankrupt. They will just change hands. The bankers will take the hit. So the shale and US production will remain high. There's two more players that's coming in. One is Suriname and Guyana in South America. These two will add by 2025, 2030, 4 to 5 million barrels per day to the total world production. When you look at all these players and all these production that can come in, I think OPEC will be less relevant going forward. So they will have to emerge an alliance with Russia going forward.
Thank you.
I would like to add a comment here. That's a convenient time.
Please go ahead.
Sure. I think we have all noticed, if we know a person who had a couple of episodes of heart attack, that person will be regarded as a risk, and everybody else look at him in the same way. Here we are really not talking about what OPEC did, but these are few Gulf states. During the time that I spend a lot of time in these places working on projects with very high officials, very often sons to king or sons to sultan of these places, I developed very close relationship with them in the course of projects that we did with them years ago. Unanimously, all of them told me that because this is the only source of revenue that they have to stay relevant. They weren't talking about OPEC, they were talking about themselves, because there is hardly anything else that can be done apart from some financial services. So what they have been doing at series of times, they have been giving this shock to the industry. We think it will go away, but that's not the case. All those who invested in Bakken, all those who have invested in Permian shales, or South Texas shales and elsewhere, these are very often financial institutions and banks. These shocks are going to have a cumulative effect. So the next time that the price begins to go up, those financial institutions are going to be very wary of investing again large sums of money, and therefore the objective of those few Gulf states have been achieved, cutting back significantly on the investment. For example, in the US. In the US, it takes time, the lead time to go and get an area, invest in it, and bring oil production up. You're looking at 2, 3, 4, probably 5 years. And if you see few of these shocks, people are going to be really reluctant to make major investments. So if their objective was to really depress US oil production, they are going to achieve that to some extent where new investment has not gone in. But places that we have invested billions of dollars in drilling all these expensive wells, anywhere from $10 to $30 million, we are going to open them up again. Therefore, where the infrastructure is in existence, we are going to bring those productions back as soon as the price reaches over the break-even price. But with regards to new investments, I have a feeling that they have achieved their objective. But I don't think to what extent that affects the rest of the world. Russia is operated on a very different system than the economy that we have here in the US and South American nations, African nations. But when it comes to new investment in those places, that really requires banks, they are going to be a lot more careful than the past, because 2014, it happened exactly the same thing. And now we had it. It happened in the past as well. Therefore, there's going to be a reluctance in major investment in oil and gas. Now, is OPEC going to become irrelevant? No, because that's a group of companies that are producing significant amount of, remember, energy. It's not about oil, energy that the world needs. So they are going to remain a force. But by what they have done, they are going to remain more relevant than in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bayat. And with this, I like to move on to next part of our webcast. Can I ask everybody to mute their microphones besides the panelists, please? Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bayat, and others. Really interesting thoughts, and pretty much right on. We talked about this current situation, a little of the past, and maybe short-term future, but I think we like as well to move on to what the future has for energy consumption in general. So the next question that I'd like to bring up, and we have around 20 minutes for this discussion left. We will have another 15 to 20 minutes time for answering the questions. Dr. Samoui is receiving the questions from the audience, and I will then reflect on those when the time comes. So maybe I just jump into the, a little more question that we all drive. We all drive, and most of us probably have gasoline cars. And I'm monitoring the Tesla stocks, and I'm surprised that did not really go down. I would think people would think oil prices crashed and nobody's gonna buy electric cars. So I like to bring up this question as a maybe future trend, and ask Mr. Pebdani to provide us with his thoughts. I think you're muted, Mr. Pebdani. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Let's face it. The younger generation, they're all into saving the environment, which is a good cause. And also, one of the main causes of that would be using electric vehicles. They will have a big impact. And if you live in China, you see there's a lot of motorcycles, motorbikes, but they're all electric. So the future is a trend, the future is towards electric vehicles and less combustion engine cars. And the Tesla stock is, of course, totally irrational. I don't know how it goes up and down on a daily basis. But the trend is towards more electric vehicles, and that will have an impact on the transportation fuel requirements, a significant impact going forward. And I can see a day where there will be a lot of oil remaining in the ground, like coal, for example. Nobody ever thought the coal industry would be the way it went, but oil can go in that direction also, and the renewables will pick up steam. But oil is relevant for the foreseeable future, and the prices will remain depressed for quite a while.
If I may add,
going back to comments, go ahead.
Please,
one more comment. We're going to go back to Dr. Bayat's comment that the OPEC achieved their objective of shutting down some of the U.S. production. But remember, in 2014 collapse, shale break-even price was $70, $75. Today is $35 to $40. I assure you, next year will be 15 to 25 bucks. So this is the service companies like Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes. These are the ones who are getting squeezed, and they will have to come up with new technologies to reduce the break-even price for their producers. Go ahead, Mr.
Please, yeah. In connection with all the great points that the colleagues made, I was thinking, if you want to put them all together, one key question would be, what is the new normal for the oil price? So is it going to be, and it's actually building on your last point, is it going to be staying and stabilizing around $25, $30, or it's going to be back to 40, 45? And that question significantly depends on what is the lasting effect of coronavirus crisis on the total demand for oil. So I want to follow Dr. Takin's point of making numbers. So if we look at a unit of oil, crude oil, into refined products. In the US, of course, it's different. It's like 50%. The rest of the world is a bit different. But we always need to remember that almost 60% of crude oil goes to transportation. It's gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel altogether. And the rest is almost not the variable. So if putting aside the heating oil, the rest of the refining process is not constituting a valuable income for the refiners. So the most important driver of demand and revenue for the global crude oil market is the transportation. That's one thing we need to fix with the audience most of the time. Another question would be, what is the transitory and what is the permanent effect of coronavirus? And I think that's one thing that we can bring up, whether the new style of working and living that people have experienced in the past few weeks, is it going to stay there for beyond this crisis or not? And that's probably, we may say it depends, but I think most of us can agree that it may have a few million barrels of a day of cutting from transportation demand in general. You know, companies are going to go letting their employees work online. People may adopt a new style of not traveling that much. And we know that the oil cost curve is very steep towards the end. So you just cut 5-6 million barrels from global demand, the price goes down significantly. It's very elastic at that point. So maybe that would be a question that we can conclude by the end of this panel, that what is the expectation of permanent shift in the demand for refined products after the crisis is over? We all know that during the crisis, we're not talking about a reduction of 20-25 million barrels a day, but how much of that, in addition to the electric vehicles, which is the other competitor, is going to remain there? I think it's the key determinant of the new price level for the crude oil in the long run.
Thank you, Ghoddusi, for your input. If there are no other comments on this, I would like
if I may,
Sure.
in your last question, outlook for oil, what would be the case? If I may share my prejudice, I want to say, my view is that I think oil will still be a major source of fuel for the world, at least 40, 50 years from now. And I give you a very simple example of looking at coal. Now, coal was the source of industrial energy for industrial revolution for many centuries. And before the First World War, Churchill, in the United Kingdom, changed the fuel for the British Navy from coal into oil. And oil has been becoming the major fuel for the past century, more than that. And coal was the one which was supposed to die and go out. And yet, in 2018, the second largest source of primary energy consumption in the world was coal. So coal still has a big contribution to play, in spite of everything, environmental concerns, policy, governments. So I think oil, it would take a long time for it to go out. And I think it is important for us, not because we are all in oil, that there is a lot of still future for oil, and for us and our younger generation, I think we have to encourage them to go. Of course, technology is changing, is making it more efficient. There are so many things happening, but oil will continue. I can discuss a bit more later on, but as a quick answer to your question, I thought just to put this bullet point in the mind just for discussion in case we're off. But I think is the main point. We should not discount oil so quickly in spite of all these ups and downs.
May I ask
I'd like to add a comment here.
Sure, we have a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes for Dr. Daneshy, 1 or 2 minutes for Dr. Mr. Serajian, and I like to have 10 minutes maybe left at the end to conclude with a more personal question. Please go ahead, Dr. Daneshy.
Let's don't forget that even if we go to electrical cars, for the generation of electricity, you still need to have fuel. And that fuel is generally oil and gas. And even if we go next thing, I go to hydrogen cars. In order for us to go to that level, you need to get the hydrogen. The source of hydrogen is methane. So what we are looking at is various levels of efficiency, not stopping the use of oil and gas. We're just talking about more efficient ways of using oil and gas in order to take care of our energy needs. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay, just a 1 minute comment. So my point is the low oil and gas price will definitely impact the renewable sector, such as electrical cars and so on. So there's this linear regression, or maybe inverse regression, between the oil price and the renewable energy or electrical cars market. So probably that renewable energy sector will not flourish as expected in the next in the upcoming years. The other important fact is low energy price will decrease the investment in exploration and production in the upcoming years, and that will definitely impact the oil production in 5 or 6 years down the road, because we need to do the exploration, we need to do investment on some of the fields so that 4 or 5 years down the road we can start producing from those fields. So if we don't invest right now, then we shouldn't expect new fields to come to the pipeline in the next 5 or 6 years. So I see that probably the low oil price will continue for a while, maybe for 2 years or so, or 2 or 3 years. But the low investment as of now, or at this situation, will impact the prices, and the prices will go eventually up in probably 4 or 5 years from now.
Thank you, Mr. Serajian. Great comments altogether. We have like 8-9 minutes left, and since we have a big portion of in our audience professionals who are at early stages of their career or somewhere halfway, maybe another 20 years left. I like to put this question out and see what your thoughts are. What are your advices? How do you advise? What type of skill sets do we need for the future if we want to stay in the energy section? And for this, I like to go alphabetic again and ask Dr. Bayat to share his thoughts with us.
Sure, with pleasure. I think the key would be to be flexible, to get as much of a scientific skill as you can get, operational skill as you get, and be flexible so that you can work in different capacities. About 6 months ago, I had the pleasure of addressing the power generators convention. And I went there with a message that everybody told me that as soon as they hear my message, they're all going to woo me in the conference. I went there with a message to tell them that the future of US is different than many other parts of the world. The future of energy in the US has to do with the fact we have so much cornered gas. Therefore, gas should be used to generate electricity. However, every power generation facilities should have the ability to take the stacked gas and inject it back deep in the ground to generate electricity as zero carbon footprint. I can tell you that I had 2 or 3 minutes of standing ovation, and I told them the oil industry has been doing that for about 40, 50 years. All they need to do if they want to turn electric cars to the future is to follow this simple rule of getting the carbon dioxide and injecting it deep in the ground. Now, with regards to the future, those who would like to work in the United States, be flexible, because even if you want to produce gas, you still need reservoir engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, drilling, and so on to produce that gas. And then to inject it back in the ground, you need all the skill sets that we have. So even if oil becomes secondary in the US, assuming prices will remain in the $30 range, which means many of our fields will not be commercial to do regardless of all of our innovations. But being flexible, that's the way to the future. Energy is the future, still is the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bayat. And please, everybody, please keep your comments between 1 and 2 minutes so we can stay more or less within our time limits. Dr. Daneshy, what are your thoughts on that?
There are several factors here which are in play. First of all, we need to recognize that petroleum engineering is a somewhat limited discipline. If you look at the technical staff in the oil and gas industry, there are as many electrical and chemical and mechanical engineers in our industry as there are petroleum engineers. So one of the things that I have been advocated for several years is to expand the scope of education in petroleum engineering so that a petroleum engineer is not limited to working just in the oil and gas industry, but they can actually be productive in other industries as engineers, general engineers, and not as specialists in the oil and gas. The situations that we are facing right now, we have more than 100,000 people out of work. And majority of these people who are out of work right now, their skills are somewhat limited to the oil and gas industry. So that is a point that needs to be recognized and discussed within the educational community to expand the scope of teaching in the oil and gas industry, in the petroleum engineering, so that our engineers can be productive in other disciplines outside of the oil and gas if the situation arises. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Daneshy. Dr. Ghoddusi, it's your turn. What's your thoughts? We don't hear you, Dr. Ghoddusi.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, sorry. I was saying that my view is probably much more narrower than the rest of the panel, but from a business perspective, I believe two types of skills will become very important. One is the risk management, because industry again faced the importance of understanding big shocks. And we saw that after 2009, that there was a big demand for people who can model risks and think about managing risk. The second one, which builds on the point Mr. Bayat made, was that industry needs to build flexibility in its production and business system. And for that, we need people who can understand the valuation of flexibility, basically. In the new investment plans, you need to go with much more possibility of cutting down and so on. And that's in the border of technical and economic skills of how to model this, what we call the real options for flexible production. And the third one, I think the WTI case was one, people who can understand this intersection, people who can understand how the markets for energy interact with the physical nature of supply, storage, and demand side. This probably would be the three skills industry would be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghoddusi. Mr. Pebdani, what are your thoughts?
Okay, I agree with everybody that flexibility is of utmost importance, and please use this downturn as an opportunity to strengthen your weaknesses. And this is to the younger generation, of course. And the hiring will come back. It has always come back, and it will come back.
Thank you. That was brief and to the point. Really appreciate it. Mr. Serajian, your turn.
Yeah, my point is more or less from two personal and technical standpoint. I have some suggestions from the personal standpoint, and these are what I have observed in the past couple years after I myself got laid off from a company maybe like 4 years ago or so. And I'm telling my own experience. I noticed that we have been so much drowned into technical world that we almost completely ignored some of the opportunities that come along. So in other words, we have been living in a comfortable zone for too long. And when the shock comes, we're not prepared for it. So let's just imagine that you will receive a call from your manager right now. Let's just imagine that today is the day that you get laid off. So what are your plans? So I've talked to numerous friends of mine, and surprisingly, I see nobody is quite ready for this. And that they say, okay, let's go with the flow and see what happens. But I encourage everybody to just sit with themselves and think for a while that assuming that I get laid off today, what are my plans? What are my plan B? What are my plan C? No, many people are not prepared and ready for it. And they say, okay, we look for a job, we work at McDonald's. And this is really surprising to me. So first thing is mental preparedness and being ready for surprises. Second thing is financial preparedness, especially when somebody works in oil and gas sector for quite a long time. They get used to some certain level of lifestyle, and changing that lifestyle is somewhat difficult. So I also want everybody to think about that aspect of the life. There are so many unnecessary things that can be easily cut back to be prepared. So from the technical standpoint, I just want to emphasize that probably something that 20 years ago, 10 years ago was a hot topic, today it might not be quite relevant, or it might be even automated. So automation, new technologies are coming every day, and putting so many people with old-fashioned knowledge back at home. These are the comments that these are the things that people need to work on and broaden their.
I apologize, just for the sake of time. I really appreciate you sharing your personal experience on this and advice. I'm sure many people in the audience appreciate that.
Thank you.
I like to move on to Mr. Takin, so he has a chance to experience, talk on this. He has seen a wide range of career contributions. He moved from working for operators to being an advisor to institutions such as OPEC. And Dr. Takin, what are your thoughts? What is your advice for younger generation?
With pleasure. Of course, it's difficult, it's impossible to advise a young person on what will happen in the world and how to be prepared for it. But I would say, first of all, choose a subject that you like. So anyone, whatever he's doing, is it a subject that you like, you love doing it? This is one thing. Second, be flexible. As many people have mentioned already, last Mr. Serajian, that many of these things can quickly become out of date. So be flexible, and for example, to be good, have expertise, develop your expertise in information technology, IT. There is so much happening in all fields, not only in oil, in medicine, communication, that with the classical, conventional industry and science, will soon become out of date. So do whatever you like, that you love, that is important, and be flexible, educate yourself completely, especially to my personal view in information technology. And last, that in spite of what we like, write papers doing this, get excited with our own expertise and technical knowledge, that all this thing is for a company, and the company is there to make profit. So what we do, it has to have value for that institution. Can it be monetized? Is it going to make a contribution to that? And we should not be carried away with excitement that this is interesting. In the last SPE, I gave this and so on, etc., that it has to have relevance to become monetized and make the company, help the company to make a profit.
Great advice, Dr. Takin. Thank you very much. So with this, our panel session kind of concludes, but we have a few minutes time, maybe another 10, 15 minutes time for going over some questions from the audience. And I like to start with a question from audience that is asking Dr. Ghoddusi specifically for comment. And the question is, how do you think is the pandemic impact on the future of shared electric vehicles in terms of customer behavior, considering electric vehicles would only be fully beneficial if shared mobility is applied?
It's a great question. I think I didn't think about it. And there are many, many aspects that the pandemic going forward is going to change the demand structure. This is just, let's just build on this example that one of the threats to the oil industry was the autonomous vehicles and the shared mobility, which was going to cut the demand significantly, because now rather than everybody driving a car, you had one car driving around and putting people to work or back. And now with the possibility of pandemic, probably the expectation of investing on such infrastructure would be lower. If the companies saw that another pandemic may come, and then for a few months or quarters, they're going to lose the whole market, probably there would be less incentives to build that. So from my perspective, that's actually good news for the oil industry, because possibility of pandemic, on one hand, reduces the entire demand for transportation, but at the same time, it probably enhances the importance of having personal cars, which is in favor of crude oil versus electric or renewable energy. That's my short answer. But there are so many other aspects to think and brainstorm to understand the future. Thank you,
Dr. Ghoddusi. There is another question from the audience, and they are probably addressed specifically to Dr. Daneshy and Mr. Pebdani. The question is, what is the future of the oil industry, producers, service companies, if the oil price does not recover in near future? I'm assuming near future is the next 3 to 6 months. Bankruptcies, salary reductions, layoffs, social impact. These are all a lot of negativities, but I hope we have a positive touch from our panelists to it.
There are several aspects of this which are actually quite critical. First, going back to the question of supply and demand, the supply in the United States is falling, and it's falling faster than we realize. State of Oklahoma, for example, changed the regulations and they allow people to shut in wells. State of Texas is favorably looking at it, but they are not, they're waiting for a legal opinion as to whether the Railroad Commission can do that or not. Colorado is looking at reducing it. North Dakota has already done it. Louisiana has already relaxed some of the regulations related to production. There is two other factors that you need to consider. First, the shale production is maintained by the drill bit. And with that, what I mean is shale production is maintained by drilling more and more and more wells. And when, because of the conditions, financial conditions, the drilling activity has dropped, the shale production, oil production is going to go down because there are not as many wells. That's one factor. The other factor which is influencing it is that companies are not spending as much money. And so the effect, there's a third element which is also very important. This slowdown has created opportunities for companies to examine their existing practices and look at, could they have produced the same amount of oil with less cost at a cheaper price? Service companies are looking at it, and oil and gas, E&P companies are looking at it too. And interestingly enough, they're finding out that by and large, up to now, we have been overdoing it. There are ways of producing the same volume of oil and gas at a lower cost with less intensive operations. So the effect is going to be reduced cost and reduced production, which will in fact by itself encourage investment in it. Or incidentally, there's another factor which is also going on right now, which is going to impact the production. In many of these fields, the cost of lifting the oil, the cost of lifting it, I'm not talking about delivering it to Cushing, the cost of lifting the oil is more than the price of oil. As a result of it, there are quite a few operators which are just shutting in. As expensive and as difficult as it is, they're just shutting in the existing production. If the well is producing 50, 60 barrels of oil per day, it's not economical to produce it. So they're shutting them in. And the effect of that is that the production is going to go down just by the force of the economics of the operations, of the process. So there will be several factors which will influence this. First, reduce supply forced by economics. Second, reduce expenses course, by improved technology and improved understanding of what's going on. And the third thing, of course, is that U.S. market, as I said earlier, is somewhat isolated. And so we generally are counting on supplying our own energy needs from within the country. This it didn't used to be, but it is now. And so my expectation is that within the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to see a gradual rebound in energy prices, in oil and gas activities, combined with the other factors that I mentioned. It will not go back to where we were last year. That's not what I mean. But it will be better than the very gloomy picture that we have right now.
Thank you, Dr. Daneshy. Mr. Pebdani, do you have any thoughts to add?
I think Dr. Daneshy covered most of it. I'll just add a couple of points. First, there will be a lot of consolidation in the industry.
Yes.
Yeah. Number two, like for example, when the shale boom started, there was 5 fracking companies. Today there is 71 fracking companies. A lot of these will go out of business and they will be absorbed by others. But the bottom line is, as production goes down and demand has also gone down, the creativity steps in. This is where our younger generation, who are very, very smart young kids, they can come in and step in and come up. How can we reduce the cost? Like Dr. Daneshy said, I can assure you, $20 oil will be very, very good economics. When I joined the industry, gas was $1.30 to $1.50 an MCF. Today, it's the same price. And gas right now is the preferred area to invest. If gas can do it at those prices, oil can do it also. But brace yourself for a wave of consolidation, especially even in the big oil companies. Mega mergers will happen again.
I agree with that. That's very correct.
Thank you. Thank you for great comments. I'm amazed about the level of proficiency in this panel. It's just really appreciate all of that. I have a last question that I'd like to ask the panel, and maybe we go again alphabetic, but we start from Dr. Takin this time. But please make it as short as you can, within 1 or 2 minutes at most. So the question is about the academia, the petroleum engineering departments, and many other surrounding satellite faculties that contribute to petroleum engineering, petroleum science. They depend a lot on grants from industry and from the government. So with this landscape that we are in, on one side, the huge pressure on to reduce CO2 and such gases to help environment. On the other side, the now very low and cheap oil price that are contradicting each other. How do you see the future of support for these institutions that build the expertise for the future of this industry? So, Mr. Takin, you got the lead here.
Well, I'm very brief. Unfortunately, my message is that I don't know, but my feeling is that is unfortunately negative, because when there is low cash, low revenue in the industry, the first thing that they cut are grants and so on for research projects, even for their own R&D, let alone what they give to the university. So unfortunately, that has to be. But on the positive side, this is a transitory situation. And I think very soon, there will be further revenue, extra cash, and again, there will be changes of subject. So even now, an expertise in the scientist or associate professor, whatever, young, in any of the academic institutions, if he or she can think of some nice ideas, interesting ideas, be innovative, they can get a grant from, if not this oil company, the other oil company. But I agree that we have to accept that there is the majors are cutting their expenditure, they are cutting their cash outgoing, and the whole industry is forced to cut. You know, in the previous crisis, they said the industry has to cut the fat and become lean and efficient. Now they are cutting bones and meat. So it is very serious, I think, as many our colleagues mentioned that some companies are really going bankrupt, and some have asked for Chapter 11 protection and so on. So that, unfortunately, is the serious situation. I really can't say anything other than be hopeful and be optimistic and rely on your expertise and your flexibility of your knowledge to continue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Takin. Mr. Serajian, it's your turn, and please keep it to 1 minute or at most 2. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think, yeah, it definitely will impact the academia. There's probably no doubt about it. But let's see the other side of it, and that's the public interest to get into oil and gas industry. Maybe 10 years ago, when the oil price was like quite high, I'm talking about 2008-9, or even when the oil price peaked to $120 or so, there was a huge demand from students to get into oil and gas or petroleum engineering programs. Even so many experts from other majors entered into oil and gas industry. And by cutting the R&D projects from government and industry, probably part of that interest will dissipate, and part of those interested engineers or even fresh high school graduates will no longer join oil and gas industry, which is a damage in long term for oil and gas, but in short term, that saves some on the budgets.
Thank you, Serajian. Next is Mr. Pebdani.
Okay, I agree that this is a temporary issue and it will be gone sooner than we think it is. And the academia, and in particular petroleum engineering department, should start getting creative like the service industry, and keep the interest of the students in the petroleum engineering, to keep the flow of students coming and graduates coming in. They need to start getting creative, and I think they can do it.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts. Dr. Ghoddusi.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not experienced in this matter, so I let it pass. My colleagues probably are more qualified.
Thank you. Dr. Daneshy, you are involved with academia as well as with the industry. What are your thoughts?
Actually, my thinking is that if we add flexibility to it, there are lots of technologies in existence today, electronics, IT, mechanical, all sorts of things, fiber optics and so on, that can contribute to oil and gas operations. And to me, the key to this is to enlarge the scope of this, not so much just being related to petroleum engineering, how to drill a well or how to produce the well, but look at this in terms of data gathering, and pertinent data gathering and pertinent data analysis, subsurface information gathering, and for that, you need to involve more than petroleum engineers. And I think within any university, between different engineering departments and different science departments, there could be consortia put together that can look at this from a broader perspective and see what new technologies can be introduced in order for us to get better access to downhole conditions and produce the oil and gas in more economical and more efficient ways. And I think that will be the key to it. And for that, we may also need to get persuasive and convince the government that they need to do some investment in that arena too, and not just depend on the oil and gas industry alone to protect it. But there are projects like that which are going on, and they're creating very good results.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Daneshy. Last but not least, Dr. Bayat, do you see any chances for the industry to, even in this critical situation, to have some budget for academia?
I think if you look at the history of any of our major companies like BP, Shell, Exxon, in the course of any of the previous downturns, you're going to get exactly the answer we need on this one. For example, in early 1990s, BP went through a significant downturn, practically let most of its scientists and most of its experts in varieties of fields go. However, a lot of them ended up in various universities as professors and research scientists. In fact, I was part of that process. We even gave all the equipments and research tools of those scientists to the universities who accepted them as professors or associate professors with 2 or 3 years grant of their salaries. Then what happened a few years later when BP recovered, those very same individuals have trained a great deal of much younger scientists that returned back to BP, and I'm aware of it. Exxon has done the same thing, Shell has done the same thing. So I don't see this as a bad thing for the universities as long as they work with the companies, come up with creative methods such as the one that I described. A lot of those significant expertise could be saved in universities by moving these individuals into universities rather than going fishing and hunting. And as a result, in 4 years, 5 years' time, those individuals have trained the type of people that companies can afford this time as young engineers with some experience and know how to go back. I think it's positive. I really don't see that as a big problem.
Fred,
Thank you.
I add one quick thing. One area that academia, they can combine the petroleum and chemical engineering department and come up with a new curriculum that once the graduate comes out, he can go to the petroleum industry, he can go to chemical industry, he can go to pharmaceutical industry, or even chip manufacturing. They always need some sort of chemical engineers. That kind of creative or consolidation in the academia is also maybe something useful that this virus can help bring about.
Thank you. With a look to the back and learnings, I think this is a great advice. Look to the history, learn about it, learn how we managed in the past, and come with new creative ideas for going forward, and handle situations we are right now in. So with this, thank you so much from our distinguished panelists. Really appreciate your time, your contributions. It was a very valuable discussion. And I hope the audience, we had some 90 people participating in this panel discussion. I hope they enjoyed it and they could take some valuable learnings, comments from this. With this, I pass the command to Dr. Samoui. He's gonna handle it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much from all the panelists for the very insightful comments, and Mr. Araste for moderating such an event. Unfortunately, because of time restriction, we were not able to cover all the questions. Sorry about that, and I hope in the near future we will have again this kind of panel. Just for everybody information, the recorded version of this panel will be posted in the YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook page of the APPIH. Thank you and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.